object to her testimony as to the 2004 election, when the results here in Orange County, lacks a foundation.
Just say this, all this material is interesting, but I think the court has to be aware that these machines have been adopted by the state, I guess, last originally by the federal government. So I'm sure there's hearings that lead up to all this. So all these things about failure rates, this court is not going to decide whether this is the right machine to use in California or not, because that decision's been made by the legislature or the Secretary of State that passes on this. This witness may have all kinds of opinions, and they're interesting about whether she likes the machine or not. This is our machine.
Okay, I have a few other questions, Your Honor, which I think could hone in on some relevant information for the court. Now, Ms. Mercuri, moving on from failure rates, just briefly. When you talk about failure rates, that can actually result in the loss of votes being counted. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. The failure rate can also be with the VVPATs too. The VVPATs can also fail.
Okay. And did you see, and are you aware of certain precincts in particular involved in this election where there were 14 votes in each precinct that became undervotes?
I understand that there were 2 precincts in which a 9% undervote rate was experienced.
Okay. And that's consistent with, is that consistent with the 9.2% failure?
That is consistent with that, and we've seen that around the country, that the failure rate is consistent. Again, it's not saying that all machines are failing at 9.2%, but that there is a consistency with regard to that in terms of failure rates.
Okay. So in your opinion, Ms. Mercuri, based on your training, your experience, the review of documentation in this case, does it appear to you that the hard machines that we were using in this election, in the 1st district race with Mr. Nguyen, seem to be following this trend of a 9.2% failure rate?
That there's certainly evidence to indicate that there was a failure rate that is consistent with this 9.2% failure rate. So this would be, as reflected by that statement, is that this would be common. This would be considered to be usual.
Okay. And in your opinion, if Mr. Nguyen's campaign had been allowed, as it requested, to review the VVPATs, would it have been able to challenge these votes that possibly were part of this failure?
Objection, Your Honor. That calls for speculation. It assumes facts, not evidence. Nguyen was not a party who requested the recount, and they never had the statutory authority to specify what should actually happen.
I think that's true, Counsel. I think we're getting off on speculating on something now that isn't permitted by the elections.
Well, Your Honor, if I may be heard, I think that's actually part of the issue that we're here to discuss, is whether or not, out of the issue of fairness and due process, that the election code sections that we're talking about should be interpreted in such a way that Mr. Nguyen's campaign is denied the fundamental right to assess whether or not he's being incorrectly denied votes. I mean, I think it's one thing, a 9% failure rate is okay when you're talking about thousands of votes, but we're talking about 7 here. I think that's the issue. We haven't addressed the issue of how to interpret the election codes.
But the real issue is between these 2 sections. 19,253 and 15,632. How do you count this? How does the registrar of voters proceed on a recount? It just seems like we're getting farther and farther afield, speculating on what could have happened, might have been, whether these machines are perfect. The legislatures, they've adopted the election code and they've adopted this machine, I guess. I'm not sure where we're going.